Welcome to another lecture of our course, Machine Learning Basic Principles. It is my great pleasure to have as guest today Professor Minna Huotilainen, which is a world-leading expert on understanding the learning machine which everybody of us has between our ears in the human brain. And I'm really looking forward to hear how learning works, or part of learning works in the human brain. And it turns out that some aspects are quite similar to what you hear about how machines learn. Do you remember what the main building blocks are of a machine learning problem and its solution? A hypothesis space. So we have particular hypotheses, and this is very similar to us humans. We have hypotheses of how the world functions. For example, if I let this alone, I have the hypothesis that it will fall down. So I make a prediction. And I evaluate the prediction then by trying it out, by doing a trial or an experiment, and looking if my prediction is correct. So I somehow estimate the prediction error, and if it's wrong, my prediction, I change my hypothesis. And something similar is also happening in the human brain, in particular in the early human brain, and it's amazing. It's, I guess, to some extent still a mystery how we are able to learn a language basically from zero. When we are born, we only observe the environment, but after a few years we manage to speak. And we will hear some aspects about this process today from Professor Minna Huotilainen. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I work at the University of Helsinki at the Department of Education, but this is where I was raised as a scientist, because I have very great memories from this hall when I was a student here studying mainly math, if I remember right, in this room. So today I'm going to talk about the human brain, especially in infants, and the way that it can be compared to artificial learning machines. And my data that I'm presenting to you mainly comes from the auditory system, for the simple reason that that's what I've been studying. So that's why we always use the auditory data here as a kind of the proof of concept that we can look into in the human brain. I'm going to talk a little bit about, first of all, what needs to be the learning content. What does the brain have to figure out? What are the goals for the developing skills? Of course, we have to learn the language. And then it's quite interesting that we have some concepts that we can use for the language learning, and that can be really very helpful in understanding how the language learning actually occurs. And then, of course, we talk a little bit also about music, because the human brain doesn't only respond strongly to language, but it also responds very strongly to music. We can even call music the other language of humans. And of course it has some of the same features as speech, but it also has some different features. And then, first of all, what is the information that is available for this learning? Of course we have lots of exposure. Already starting before the baby is born there is some exposure, but then it gets more specific after the baby is born. There's a lot of information coming to the ears all the time, 24/7 there is some kind of sound environment. And this information is heavily used by the infant's brain. But then, of course, later there is also this experimental part that the child can make a hypothesis. He can try out things, and he can try turn-taking in communication and so on. And this is another completely different way of learning. And then about the ways that this learning is happening, when we are receiving new information, we are making the trials, we are maybe required also to react to some things in our environment. This is one mode of learning, but then another mode of learning is the consolidation of information. And this is when the brain has the opportunity to not to react to anything. So this is when we are sleeping. And that's why sleeping is a key thing for human learning. During sleep, the brain has time to evaluate what has been learned, how does that fit together with the previous information, can we somehow put those things together and consolidate it into some kind of coherent learning system. So we are also going to talk a little bit about sleep too. But let's first look a bit at the hardware. On the left you can see a cut of auditory cortex during the time when the baby is born. So you can see these neurons there. Some of them are still arriving to their location, so the neurons are not born at the location of the cortex, but they are born deeper, in a deeper part of the brain, and then they travel, they literally move to their final destinations at the cortex. And this is, of course, a complete mystery. How does that happen? Why does that happen? Why are the neurons born away from the locations into which they then finally travel? But that's the way that the brain is developing. When those cortical cells arrive to their final locations, they immediately start the process of making connections between each other and also long-distance connections to other areas in the brain. And of course, these connections are vital for the neurons because that's the way the neurons will survive. If a neuron is not connected to anything else, it will die, and it will be just cleaned out from the cortex. After 2 years, you can see what has happened on the right. You can see that there are plenty of new connections. These have been formed during the learning processes of the first 2 years, which have included learning to walk, learning to talk, and so on. And some of these connections are still slow. The connections become faster throughout life. Especially when we use the connections, they become faster. And the mechanism for that is that there becomes more insulation in the axon, in the part of the neuron that is delivering the information to the other neurons, maybe to a distant area or in the vicinity. And this insulation is actually fat, so that's why fat is so important in our diet. This process continues for a long, long time until our 30s, so it's a very long process. But the forming of the basic connections is very fast during the first 2 years of life. If you think about the process of this kind of learning, it is of course partially generated by the genetical information. So there is some automatic processes for the locations of the neurons, where they are going to go and so on. But it's also partially dictated by the exposure to the outer world and the information coming from the outer world. So the hardware of the network is also dictated by the environment. If there is a certain types of features in the environment, if in the speech there are certain features that are important, so those will be highlighted not only in the functions of the network, but also in the structure, in the hardware of the network. And this is, of course, ultra-high plasticity. Human brains are very, very plastic, and they are very able to adapt to many different kinds of environments, and, for example, to many different types of languages. This is the method that we are mainly using to study the newborn brain. So we are measuring the electroencephalogram. This is a very simple way to do it because it's just some changes of voltage on the surface of the scalp. And these changes of voltage are, the neuronal activity has given rise to these changes of voltage. They have traveled through the tissues of the head, and some of them have been insulated a little bit, and some of them have been also distorted quite a lot, so we cannot so easily determine which part of the brain actually has been causing these changes of voltage, but more accurately in time we can determine if we, for example, present a sound, and immediately after this sound we see some potentials that are evoked constantly after the presentation of the sound, so we can then understand that they are based on the analysis of that sound. This timing accuracy is on the order of millisecond, so it's very, very accurate, and we can really follow in time very clearly what is happening after some kind of event, like hearing a sound or hearing a word or so. Of course, this is a measure of the activity of the neurons directly, so there is no time lag or anything like that in this system. In infants, we always measure when they are sleeping. And the reason for this is that while they are awake, they are moving a little bit, and every time you move your muscles, especially in the head, you will also get a signal which is distracting our measurement. When they are sleeping, they are quiet and they are processing a lot of information and their brains are learning, so that's a perfect time for making the measurements. And it's very comfortable for the voluntary subjects of our studies. There is another way of measuring very similar activity from the brain by using magnetic fields. Of course, this is much more complex technically because the magnetic fields coming from the brains of humans are very, very small. So you have to have very precise devices for actually catching the magnetic field, and then you also have to have magnetically shielded rooms to keep the other magnetic fields, for example, from the earth, from the computers and so on, out from your measurement. This is research that is done also here in Otaniemi in the AMI Center. There are these MEG devices that can be used for measuring brain activity. The device is actually designed for adults. As you can see in the picture on the right, it's like an old-fashioned hair dryer type. The reason for that is that it's full of these superconducting quantum interference devices that require liquid helium to stay superconductive. So that's why it's much more clumsy measurement compared to the EEG. But then again, it's much more precise in locating the activity, where the activity is actually coming from in the brain. What we have been doing is we have been using this instrument to measure data from babies' brains. And of course, the babies' heads are very small compared to the adult heads, so we cannot capture the magnetic field from all over the baby's head, but only when he's lying on his side we can capture the information from the closest sensors. But anyway, even in that situation, we can record the magnetic field coming from, for example, the auditory cortex of a sleeping baby, as you can see in the picture on the left. So these are the types of measurements that we are mainly doing. Here on the picture on the left, you can see active electrodes in an EEG measurement, which brings a lot of precision also to the experiments. These are data from Jorvi Hospital that we are measuring infants there. And then on the right, you can see also measurement from the fetal brain. So before the baby is born, of course, the brain is active even before birth, and the activity is very similar to that, what happens after birth, and that's a very interesting thing to measure, of course. The magnetic field from the fetus's head comes out from the mother's abdomen, and we can actually record that also with magnetic field sensors. These are pictures from Biomac Laboratory, Meilahti Hospital here in Helsinki. And these recordings have been capturing the auditory responses of human fetuses. Of course, this measurement is completely safe because it's not even putting the fetus into any kind of magnetic field, it's just recording the magnetic field coming from the fetus's head. So let's take a very, very simple task for the brain to predict the auditory environment. We can make the auditory environment very predictable by presenting the same sound over and over again. And this becomes a very easy prediction. Since the sound has been occurring already several times, the prediction is, well, it will probably continue as it has now been going on. So the repetition is a very simple feature, but it's a very important feature in the sound environment. If, for example, you think about the natural sound environments, you can have people walking or a clock ticking or some water dropping or something like this. All of these are forming very repetitive sound environments. And for the brain, it's very good to be able to predict this repetition, because then you don't really have to waste your cognitive resources for modeling every sound separately. You notice that there is a pattern, you model the pattern, and then you know what's going to happen. And then your attention can be focused on something else. So maybe in the future, this baby who is listening to these repetitive sounds of walking or clock ticking, maybe in the future he will be able to listen to something else at the same time, direct his attention away from this kind of repetitive patterns. And then if something happens, if the repetition doesn't continue, if the prediction fails, so then that is a good time to react, because then it means that there is some information, something is actually happening. And the auditory system is very good at this kind of modeling of the repetition. And here you can see a very simple way of kind of dealing with the data, with the information. So the sound comes in to the auditory system, and of course some features are detected from the sound, and some kind of perception is then occurring because of this feature detection. But at the same time, this sound is memorized. And then when new sounds start coming, this memory trace of the previous sounds and then the features that are extracted from the new sound are compared. And if the comparison process notices that they are the same, so the prediction is fulfilled, everything continues as it used to be, there is no perception. So the auditory system can actually then direct the attention to something else. But if they don't match, if there is a mismatch, like for example in the case of those red sounds there that are just slightly higher in pitch than the repetitive sounds, so then in that case it makes a lot of sense to perceive something. So this kind of a perception would be then important because it is breaking the expectation. The expectation was failing, so this failure is bringing information. These types of responses have been recorded in humans since 1970s already. They are called mismatch negativity responses, and the first time they were recorded in sleeping newborns was 1990 here in Finland. And also with Emichi, these responses have been recorded, and it seems that this is a very automatic process. So there is nothing happening, the baby is sleeping, but his brain is processing this information, making the model of the auditory environment, and then noticing when this model actually doesn't work. And this response that you see here is a response that is showing the mismatch detection. So the brain has noticed the difference between the repetitive pattern and then this specific sound that was breaking the pattern. Of course, this repetition can be masked by other sounds. So the auditory system must actually be able to segregate sound streams in order to make any sense of the surrounding sounds. If you are interested in this topic, I highly recommend this Al Breckman's book on auditory scene analysis, where he's talking about how the auditory system is able to segregate sounds into streams. This is a very automatic process. So for example, now you are listening to my voice, but there are simultaneously other sounds in the room. For example, some humming from the projector. For your experienced adult auditory system, it's a very easy task to separate these two sounds from each other. They come from different directions, they have completely different features. So actually, if you choose my voice over the projector's sound, you don't even notice that the projector is humming, but it is actually there. But your auditory system is capable of making this segregation based on the differences in the features, and then making the selection, and then allowing you to listen to the more important sound, and somehow softening the other sounds, the other streams that are not so important. And this is vital for learning languages, for example, because every time you listen to a person talking, there's definitely going to be other sounds at the same time. They could be softer, but they could also be quite loud sounds. And if you would mix everything together, if your auditory system wouldn't be able to segregate these sound streams from each other, so then you would actually have to model everything. Your speech model would contain information from the projector humming, and that doesn't make any sense. That's not a good speech model. So you first have to be able to segregate them, and only after that you have to be able to make the model. So here is a very simple schematic of how that would happen. You would have two sound streams coming in at the same time. One of them is an interesting sound that has a lot of things to model and is somehow interesting. And then there is another simultaneous sound stream that is not interesting. They both come to the feature detection process, and this feature detection process is able to segregate them into two separate sound streams. Both of them are modeled at some level. Both of them will form some kind of memory trace, because this memory trace is important for keeping these sound streams kind of coherent. And then the comparison process will actually only contain this interesting sound stream. The other information from the other sound stream is softened, so that it's not actually generating such a clear perception. And this kind of a processing model is important for everyday use and modeling of sounds. We were able to measure this in human infants. The newborn babies' brains also make this automatic streaming, automatic segregation of sound streams, just like adults do. So in the upper figure you can see that we mix the sound streams together. There is the interesting sound stream, but then the uninteresting one actually contains the same features. So it's a total mess. You cannot segregate. And you can also see in the responses of the infants and in the adults that there is no processing of the changes in the interesting sound streams. But what happens very quickly when we segregate the sound streams on the basis of frequency? You can see the interesting sound stream happening in the lower part of the figure somewhere at 1.8 kilohertz or something like that, and there are things to model and there are changes in the repetitive patterns. But then there is simultaneous lower frequency sound stream. And of course, frequency is a very good feature to segregate sound streams. So the auditory system of adults, but also that of infants, is able to segregate these into two separate sound streams. And you can see as a result of the modeling that the interesting changes, the prediction errors in the interesting stream give rise to a clear response, both in babies, but adults, but also in babies. So this means that this system is already functional in the newborn baby's brain. The auditory system also pays a lot of attention to co-occurrences. This means that certain sounds seem to go together very often. For example, if you think about the sound of your home door, when you open the door, you have this kind of sound like click, click, and then when you open the door. These two sounds go together so well that you would never think about it. But next time when you go home, please try to think about this thing. They go together because they mean the door. They mean that you touch the door, you open the door, and the door opens normally. That's the information from the sounds that you are getting. But actually those are separate small sound particles, but they belong together into this coherent concept of your home door sound. This is a very important task for the auditory system to make this kind of connections between separate sounds, because otherwise the auditory system would have to analyze everything separately, every tiny piece of sound separately, and that doesn't really make sense when you compare it to how the world works. So one way to learn words, not the meaning of the words, but the concept of words, is to pay attention to the co-occurrences of syllables. So the baby's brain is exposed to this kind of co-occurrences a lot. When an adult is speaking to the baby, he's definitely going to use the same words over and over again. And those same words are going to contain the same syllables in the same order. So if, for example, the adult is saying to the baby several times a day, baby, so these two separate syllables, baby, will be connected together if the brain realizes that there is a co-occurrence of these two syllables. So only the exposure and statistical comparison to co-occurrences is enough information for the auditory system to actually figure out that these two syllables belong together. And this is a very effective way to learn words. Of course, the baby doesn't realize what the words mean, but that's just to make some kind of patterns of these words. So here you can see this process. There is already a memory of the first part of the sound, and when the second part of the sound is coming in, the process of co-occurrence detection notices that, hey, these two syllables have come together in the same order before, so they must mean something when they are put together. And this is a very good basis, of course, then for later language learning. Here are some of our data on this kind of experiment. So we invented a new language which has a vocabulary of 10 words, and all of these words are composed of 3 syllables. So these are all nonsense words. They don't mean anything, and we were presenting them so that the syllables were presented separately. So of course in normal language you have more distance between the words than inside the words. But in this language we took out that prosodic cue because we were interested in looking at how well the newborn auditory system can pay attention to only the co-occurrences as the only marker of words. So this language would sound like something like this. Ea, ke, sa, ku, I, se, ai, ka, and so on. So there were spaces between the syllables so that the prosody doesn't reveal when when the word is starting. The only cue is the co-occurrence. So how long would you think that it would take from a newborn baby to listen to this kind of a sequence and figure out that there are 10 words, all of them have 3 syllables, these are the words, now I know them? How long do you think that the sleeping baby has to listen to a sequence like this? Any guesses? Well, our guess was that we have something like 2 hours with the baby. After that, he has to go back to get some feeding and so on. So we were hoping that during this time of 2 hours, there would be some evidence of this learning. We were quite wrong because it took something like 5 minutes. 5 minutes of listening to this nonsense sequence of syllables, and the baby's brain started showing signs of learning, showing a different reaction to the first syllable, which is unpredicted because the words can come in any order. A different response to the second and third syllables, which are completely predicted. If you know the first syllable and you know the word, then it means that you know the second and the third syllable. They are totally predictable. So the brain response looks different to the first syllable compared to the second and third syllable after 5 minutes of listening to the sequence. Yeah. Adult brain is very bad in this. If I would give you a pen and paper and you would work really hard trying to figure out the words, you might be able to do that, but it's really very, very difficult. This automatic process that doesn't require any effort from the baby is sleeping during the experiment. It's very, very fast. You can see some evidence of this also in the adult brain, in the subconscious level. But it's very hard for the adults to use this information. I believe the process is still there in the adult brain, but we just don't hear it because we have so many processes in our brains. So consciously this information is very difficult to capture. That's a very good question, thank you. We have been able to show also learning that happens before birth. So these experiments go so that we have a large group of pregnant women and we give them some auditory material that they promise to listen to every day via loudspeakers with a loud volume, not too loud of course, but clear, loud volume. And then after the babies are born, they immediately bring them to us and we make the brain recordings with the same sounds that were presented on the tape, but this time with some minor mistakes or changes in the sounds. These changes allow us to test if the sounds were actually learned. So what kind of sounds were they able to learn? They were able to learn melodies. So if we played on the tape a simple children's song or melody several times per day throughout the latest part of the pregnancy, and then after the baby came to the brain experiment, we played the same melody, but this time with some minor changes in the notes. So this modified version was also a children's song. It was just a different one. It had different tone, different notes in the melody. What we saw was brain responses to these changed notes. So the baby's brain, even before birth, was able to capture this melody, make a model of it, remember it after birth, and then also react to those changed notes. And the same thing for our pseudo words. So we presented on the tape also some pseudo words of 3 syllables. And when we played those same pseudo words, but this time with minor alterations in the phonemes, in the pitches of the phonemes and so on, we were able to see the memory traces from prior to birth. So the auditory system carried this model of the sound that had been heard during the pregnancy until after birth, and was able to react to changes in those models. Why would we have this kind of learning? Why would it help a baby to have learned already something during the fetal period? Well, my guess is that during the fetal period, when the brain is developing, this information coming from outside the mother's abdomen, but also from the mother's speech, is kind of preparing the auditory system for the later development. When the baby is born, he has to start language learning, and if he has already some capabilities, some knowledge of his native language, especially the way that his mother is speaking, so that might then be helpful for the network in the auditory system to develop towards understanding that specific language that the mother is going to speak to him then after birth also. And also other sounds from the environment, other people speaking and so on. So, what does the infant auditory system have to learn? Variations in pitch and intensity, sometimes variations in duration, like in Finnish language. These are very important markers of prosody, and they are very much needed in understanding language. Stressed and non-stressed syllables, they give the rhythmic variation to speech, and in most languages, they also tell you where the words are starting and ending. Especially in the Finnish language, where we always have the stress on the first syllable, it's a very easy marker for the auditory system. So that is a way to make sense of the acoustic information that is the baby is being exposed to. Word and syllable stress, they help separate words and understand the meaning also. And then phonemes. This is a very important concept for the auditory system to figure out, and of course before birth there is not much information on the phonemes because of the attenuation of the maternal structure. So this information comes after birth mainly. So the baby has to actually proceed from prosody, how things are pronounced, to content all the way to the phoneme identification, what is actually pronounced. And this requires a kind of a shift in the input data feature extraction. If you think about how the person's voice sounds like, is he happy or is he very sad? This information comes actually from the lower frequency range, from below 500 Hz. Also, if the pitch is going up or down, in the end of the sentence, in the Finnish sentence, it always goes down. That's the way Finns speak. So this information also helps the baby's auditory system to parse the speech, and this is also below 500 Hz. How intensely this person is speaking, is he speaking fast or is he speaking slow, and so on. All of this information comes from the lower frequency spectrum. So this is where the auditory system is in the beginning very intensively following. But after the baby is born, this information actually becomes only one part of the information that the auditory system is receiving, and there is something very important happening also in the upper part of the frequency spectrum. And this is the formats. Yes? Yeah? Oh, sorry. Yeah?
How does the system actually learn the variation between features? Because here,
yeah, this is the frequency channel that you have to analyze in order to figure out what is the intensity, what is the pitch contour, what is the emotional contour, and so on. So all of the information is packed in the same frequency range. Of course, it's packed into different features. So the feature of intensity is, you have to analyze how intense the sound is. The feature of pitch is, you have to analyze the variations of the fundamental frequency. But all of this information is in the same channel, in the lower frequency channel. And after birth, the baby has to realize that also the higher frequencies actually matter. So here you can see a spectrum of some phonemes, and you can see that the differences, the features that are differentiating the phonemes from each other, so what is the difference between A and E, actually lies in the higher frequency area. So the auditory system has to turn towards the higher frequencies and start to analyze those two. And this is a major change, because previously all the important information used to be in the lower frequency areas, and that information is still very relevant. But then you also have to figure out that there is information in the higher frequencies, the information from the formats. If you don't figure this out, you will never learn to understand the language, because these frequencies are the ones that are separating the phonemes from each other. Of course, via exposure, this kind of learning happens. So after the baby is born, he is exposed heavily also to this high frequency spectrum. And there are variations, and the auditory system starts naturally to pay attention to these variations in most cases, in the cases of the healthy babies. But we have evidence of problems in this area where the auditory system doesn't start naturally to look at this higher frequency information. If you look at the phonemes, how they are actually defined in linguistics, you very often see figures like this. So here, the first formant, the energy peak, the frequency of the first energy peak is presented in the y-axis, and then the second formant, the second energy peak in the spectrum is presented in the x-axis. And for some reason, the linguists always draw the axis the wrong way. I don't know why, but that's how they do. So here, these dots are representative pronunciations of a group of people of these phonemes. So for example, the green dots, you can see that they are pronunciations of U of different persons. Of course, everybody pronounces it slightly in a different way. Somebody is using the formant frequencies of 400 and 900, but another person is using 450 and 1000. All of those are categorized as U by adults. But you can see that there's a lot of variation, and they are not always the same. And this is the information, the grouping of these phonemes is something that the auditory system has to figure out just by exposure. Of course, different languages have a different number of phonemes, so some languages are very easy, like Spanish, for example, only has a few phonemes, and then other languages are very difficult, and they might contain a very large variation of phonemes, like Portuguese, for example, has a very large set of phonemes, and it takes a longer time to figure that out from the auditory system. The goal here is to understand that those black dots belong together and those green dots belong together. They actually signify something. It is a concept when the formant frequencies fall in that area, and they can be categorized or labeled as a certain phoneme. And this is required for speech understanding. It's called the phoneme map. That's what we call it in neuroscience. So this map is a kind of a memory model of these phonemes of your native language. Here you can see the phoneme map of a Finnish language on the left. And then there is one more phoneme that we Finns don't have. It's called the Estonian Ö. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it poorly, but it is a phoneme that lies between the Finnish Ö and Finnish O. It's very important in Estonia because you needed to buy olut beer in Estonia, so you can practice to pronounce it. Finns don't have that phoneme in our phoneme map, but of course Estonians do. Otherwise, the Estonian phoneme map is very similar to the Finnish one, so you can very easily compare them. In order to see if the phoneme actually exists on the phoneme map, you have to measure the size of the mismatch negativity response to that phoneme. And this is what was measured actually here. Can I use this one? Yeah. So here you can see brain responses from Finns and Estonians to a phoneme that doesn't exist in either ones of language. It's here between E and Ö. So we don't have that, and the Estonians don't have that. So the response is very small. Here are responses to phonemes that we both have. This is Ö and this is O. So both Finns and Estonians have a strong mismatch negativity response to those because they exist on the phoneme map. But what happens here in between? The Estonians have a strong response, but the Finns have a very small response because this phoneme doesn't exist on the Finnish phoneme map, but it does exist on the Estonian phoneme map. So this is a very simple way of testing the phoneme map. Are the phonemes there? How strongly they are represented? And this kind of phoneme map has to form in the brain of the baby during the first year of life. Otherwise, this child will have problems in language learning later because this is the basic processing mechanism of the features. We cannot waste so much time that we every time measure very accurately the features of each phoneme that we hear, and then we try to make sense of it. The system has to be very automatic. It has to be able to label all the phonemes with the speed of people speaking. So it is a very fast system, an automatic system, once it has been built. Here you can see how the phoneme map to native language is emerging between 6 months and 12 months. So at the age of 6 months, we don't really have evidence of the phoneme map yet. All the brain responses are just based on the amount of difference that the surprising sound was making. But at the age of 12 months, you can see that there is evidence in the Estonian children. They already have strong responses to the Estonian phonemes, while the Finnish babies have a smaller response. So we know now that the phoneme map is built somewhere between 6 months and 12 months. So back to our schedule here. We now know that the infant brain has to learn quite many things to be able to parse language and understand language later, and also appreciate music. These same features are needed in the understanding of music. And the information that is available for the learning is just the mere exposure. So there is plenty of information coming to the auditory system, and all of this information is building these kind of processing tools to the auditory system in order to be able to then understand the language later. And the two phases of learning: receiving the information while you are awake, and then processing the information when you are sleeping. This doesn't hold to babies, because the baby's sleep is both information processing and also consolidating. It's a mixture of both. But later in life, sleep becomes the restricted area, the time when the brain has enough time to actually consolidate the information that has been received. So, some words about this memory consolidation. During wakefulness, we are receiving a lot of information all the time, even if we don't pay attention to it. But for example, when you have your eyes open, you have all the time plenty of visual information coming to your brain. When you are sitting down in the chair, there's a lot of information coming from your back, for example, how the chair feels like and so on. All of this information is traveling to your brain, and the brain is actually processing that information, even though the processing happens at the subconscious level, so you don't even realize that your brain is processing that information. The conscious processing of information is very, very limited. We cannot concentrate on many things at the same time. We have to focus on something. But the subconscious information processing is really wide, so all the information is processed somehow, to at least to a small extent, at the subconscious processes. So these are two very completely different processing streams. When we are receiving new information, it is not actually safe for the brain to mix this received new information with the process of storing information into cortical networks. Because it is actually in the cortical networks that all of our memories lie. And all of these processes that the auditory system is building, these are tools, processing tools, which contain memory traces of, for example, the native language phonemes. So it is not safe to touch those systems while they are being used. That's why we need a separate time when we are actually touching those cortical networks, permanently changing, plastically changing those connections in the networks. And for this reason, this storing of information, consolidation of new information happens during sleep. It is a kind of a risky process, because you are actually touching those networks that where you keep your memories. Yes? It is kind of temporarily stored throughout the day. And the decay is there, but it's not so bad. So it is typical that the information that is kind of relevant is kept until the evening, when the person falls asleep. Of course, some of it is lost, obviously, but this is typically not the problem. The problem typically is more that the consolidation process is somehow disturbed if the person is not sleeping enough, or if the sleep is not enough high quality or something like that. So then it can happen that actually the consolidation process is risked. Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a kind of a mini consolidation. So when we start doing some physical activity that is considered safe, so that it is very repetitive, it is continuing for quite a long time, half an hour or more, something like this. For example, take a walk in the park or something like, in your case, swimming. So then the brain starts to realize that, okay, now there is actually time to do more than the information processing is requiring. Because the information processing that you need during swimming, it's very repetitive, and you have a model for that, and your brain is able to kind of do that even though you are consciously thinking about something else. So then the brain makes advantage of that situation and starts also bringing up the memories, bringing up the unsolved problems. They have been there in the subconscious mind all the time. They have been processed there all the time. But when there is this kind of time when you really don't need your visual system, your auditory system, and so on for extremely heavy information processing, so these are actually brought to the attention of like conscious attention. And these very creative combinations may occur, things that happen very extensively during sleep, but they can also happen during wakefulness when we have this kind of time that we are using our bodily reactions, bodily functions to this kind of repetitive working. So then this kind of free information flow is much more easily possible. And this is a kind of another way of problem solving. So one way of problem solving is to really to consciously focus on the problems, learn about the nature of the problem, get a lot of information and ask people and search for more information and so on. But then there is this other problem-solving method that we can use in this kind of subconscious problem solving. And this is a kind of creative combination of things that already exist in our memory system. And some of those combinations, of course, don't work, but there might be something that actually gives the solution. And if it seems to be so then there is the need for these subconscious processes to surface. And sometimes it's this kind of aha moment that you are walking the dog and then some moment you realize that now I know how to solve this problem, I have to write it down immediately. So this is the problem has been actually being processed in the subconscious mind, but then it surfaces because it's so important, it has now been solved. And it is a little bit related to what happens during sleep. It's less effective than what happens during sleep. In sleep, the brain has all the possibilities, all the time and resources to do that, but it can be done also during the wakefulness. And I actually believe that this is a process that we should use more. We need this kind of moments. If we think from the terms of evolution, how the human brain has developed to the present mode that we have, this development has occurred during the hunter-gatherer phase of humans. It was a long time when we were living in the forest and hunting and gathering and getting shelter from the caves and so on. And during this time, our brain has developed to its present form. So we can always go back to that time and think about the life in those days and try to compare it to the life nowadays, because we have the same brain as those guys used to have. They are as clever as we are in that sense. So what their time was spent with, they had a lot of this kind of repetitive, safe activities, like, opening the shells at the home cave or something like this, which took several hours of the day. During that time, the brain was free to process information, and that might be kind of the source of the human intelligence, let alone artistic and everything like this that people have been doing. So those could be some kind of like answers to some of the present day questions. Yeah. That's a very good question, thank you. Yeah, so what happens during the night is that actually there is information transfer between the memory systems and the final memory storages in the brain. And these final memory storages, they lie all the way across the cortex. So there is a huge area in the brain that is devoted to the memory system. And this is a kind of a combination of the tools that we have to process information, and these tools themselves contain memory functions. The phoneme map is one example of that. So it is a tool. Anytime it receives information about something that can be interpreted as a phoneme, it will actually process that phoneme via these memory traces that are stored in the phoneme map. And the goal is to be able to label that phoneme with the right label very fast, as accurately as possible, and then start to receive information from the next phoneme that is coming. So the duration of the phonemes could be like 100 milliseconds, so you have to do that 10 times per 1 second. So you have to be very fast in that. So these tools and the memories are kind of intertwined in the cortical system. And now during the night, the brain is actually touching and changing those systems. And that is a risky thing, so we have to be careful not to lose the memories and not to lose the tools that we have built. The changes that are being made to those networks, they must, of course, keep the old memories there, but they also must be able to incorporate then the new memories into those same networks. Of course, sometimes the new memory is erasing the old memory. So if you have some wrong information in your brain, and then you receive the right information, what the brain has to do the next night is a heavy job. It has to get rid of the old memory trace, because now you know it's wrong, and it has to replace it with a new information. But this is quite rare. So usually we are just getting additional information to something that we know or we almost know already before. So the adjustments are going to be very slight. You had a question? Yeah, okay, thank you. So these adjustments, they are made really, like slightly in order not to lose information. Yeah.
Yeah, but of this part, regarding storing information, working to make electrons, so does it matter how much time I go sleep and what time I go to sleep?
Yes, it does a lot. So the sleep is not the kind of a steady state, but it has several different stages. So there are lighter sleep stages, and there are deeper sleep stages, and then there is also this so-called paradoxical sleep, or REM sleep, which is paradoxical in the sense that if you look at only from the EEG, it resembles wakefulness. So it is a very different stage of sleep. And this consolidation process actually needs all of those sleep stages, and the sleep stages are alternating throughout the night. So in the early part of the night, you have more of these deeper sleep stages, but also the brain comes to the lighter sleep stages and also goes to the REM sleep, but mainly spends most time in the deep sleep stages during the first part of the night. And then in the last part of the night, the brain spends more time in the REM sleep and also in the lighter sleep stages. And all of these stages have different functions for the sleep. And if you lose some parts of the night, so then of course for that night, the brain loses the capability of consolidating the information. If you lose the first part of the night, so if you would go to sleep 4 hours later than you would normally do, so you lose some of these deepest sleep stages, and this practically then means that the consolidation process is not as good as it would be if you would go to sleep at the same time every evening. If you would have to wake up 4 hours earlier than you normally do, so then you would lose the last part of the sleep, and this part would contain more of these lighter sleep stages, but also more REM sleep. In some experiments it has been shown that in that case you would then lose more of your creativity for the next day. So you would be more like looking for the obvious answer and not maybe making some more creative solutions. So these different parts of the night have different processes going on, and also the processes that are related to the first part of the night are very important for motor learning. So if you have been practicing, for example, juggling or something like this, so then you would lose that learning if you would get rid of the first part of the night. Of course, it's not as strict as that, and the structure of the sleep changes according to the needs of the brain also a little bit, but it cannot be totally compensated. So the optimum would be that you would always go to sleep at the same time every evening, and you would always wake up at the same time in the morning. Finland is very challenging because we have the problem of the light. So the light is very much dictating the way that we are able to get high quality sleep. So if you're not from Finland, my advice to you is that you need the curtains to make your room dark in the summer, and you need the bright light lamp in the winter to enjoy the sunlight in the morning hours. Otherwise it's very difficult to learn to sleep here. And the same advice to Finns also. It's a challenging place to find good sleep. Yeah. Well, the clinical sleep researchers, they say that the measure of the sleep quality and duration is the wakefulness, the vigilance of the next day. So if you have the regular sleeping rhythm and every day you don't have any problems in keeping your vigilance up, you don't feel like sleepy during the lectures or something like this, so then it means that your sleeping time is the right time. That's what they say. This is the clinical answer. There are, of course, case reports of people who sleep very little. In some of those follow-up studies, it seems that actually those people who have been sleeping very little, if you go back to their data 30 years later, you notice that they have been more prone to certain illnesses, some mental illnesses, but also some somatic illnesses, even cancer, for example. So even though they felt that they can sleep only 4 hours, it may not have been so. It's very difficult to say because those cases are quite rare, but it's, yeah, I don't know. But the mean need of sleep in adults is from 7 to 8 hours per night. 7 to 8 hours per night. Yeah.
And apart from illnesses and problems, has there been any research on clustering of personality types based on sleep duration?
Yeah, this is not really my field, but there are. I know that there are, especially temperament researchers are looking into those. So anxiety, for example, seems to be related to certain kinds of sleep problems, not being able to fall asleep. So this is called the sleep latency, when the person goes to the bed and decides that now I want to sleep, how long it actually takes for him to then finally fall asleep. And the mean value for that in well-sleeping adults is 5 minutes. So it's a very, very short time that it kind of usually takes. But in some people, they fall asleep instantly, but in other people, it might take an hour, 2 hours, and of course, this is also something that can be, like, it's a two-way street. This can also cause anxiety in persons and so on. But it is a heavily studied subject, and it has been studied also in Finland quite a lot. So there is research on that.
What I really meant is that I know that some extremely ambitious people, as a CEO position and a leading position within politics, they claim to sleep very little. And those people often have certain style of behavior which might not have some behaviors that some other people have. For example, they might not be sort of more creative, they might be very sort of, getting things done. And without suffering from it. So I was wondering if there's actually sort of correlation between like functional differences between humans who sleep little and sleep more, and there might be a clustering of very discrete behavior, like like in a beehive, you have
Yeah.
kind of things.
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. I don't know if that has been studied. Those studies that I was talking about, the creativity and stuff like that, so those are intervention studies. So that's when you take people to the sleep lab, you let them sleep for a certain time and so on, and then you test them with different types of experiments. So you see changes in the behavior of that same person when he has been sleeping in the early part of the night or in the late part of the night or the full night and so on. But those types of studies, I don't know. But even in that case, I would go back to the question of they claim they don't need more sleep, but what would happen if they would actually sleep for 8 hours? That would be a good experiment for those persons personally to do on themselves. Yeah.
I would like to go back to the positive sleep.
Yeah?
And for instance, we think that the baby is exposed to different sound, and he or she basically learns from those exposed. In this case, the sound is basically language. And usually, or often, people actually speak their native language to the let's imagine a case where there is a woman, where there's a family of, let's say, a Finnish girl and a French man. The Finnish girl speaks to the kid with Finnish language. The French man speaks to the kid in French, and the woman and the man talk to each other in English. What will be the memory implications, the psychological implications, and some maybe negative implications of that? Or is there any negative implication? And what will be your recommendation in this kind of case? Should they speak to the kid the same language, which they speak between each other, which is English? Or should they just do the same way, like 3 different languages? And also, one last point is, what kind of psychological implication, like emotional connection, the kid will have with his mom, with his dad, or will there be any?
Well, the recommendation nowadays in Finland from the language researchers and the child development researchers is that everybody should speak his native language to his child. So in that case, the rule would then be that the Finnish-speaking mother should speak Finnish, the French-speaking father should speak French, and then the child is exposed to them speaking English together, but neither of them would speak English to the child in that case. And that's what is recommended. And the reason for that is that the developmental psychologists believe that the only way that you can express yourself, I mean the best way, would be in your native language, and of course you want to have that kind of connection with your child. But this is not the case that it used to be like this. So for example, when I was born in the 60s in Finland for a Swedish-speaking father and a Finnish-speaking mother, and they were advised that they have to select one language, otherwise the baby will never learn a language well enough, so they chose Finnish, and that's why I'm a full Finnish speaker without any other native languages, even though my father is a Swedish speaker. So I never have this kind of connection with him that he has with his mother, for example, when they speak Swedish together. So it is kind of a cut between us from the language point of view. Of course his Finnish is good and so on. We can communicate, it's not a problem, but this is what is kind of trying to avoid in these rules that are given nowadays, or this kind of how they say that it should be done. It's nice that you bring up French and Finnish, because French and Finnish are two languages that have very different phoneme maps. So the French have phonemes here and here, exactly in the middle of the Finnish phoneme map. That's why Finns are so lousy in pronouncing French, and sometimes the other way around too. So it is very difficult. And if you have a child who has one parent from France and one parent from Finland speaking these two languages, this child will create a very nice phoneme map, because it will contain a lot of phonemes. It will contain the Finnish ones and the French ones, and then later when this child probably will learn more languages in his life, so the phoneme map doesn't have to adjust so much, because it already has so many different kinds of phonemes. But of course, building that kind of very complex phoneme map takes some time. And there is research showing that if you are building a phoneme map that contains more than 5 phonemes, which is the case in most languages, so it takes longer than to build a phoneme map of only 5 phonemes. It can be then seen as a kind of a child developmental kind of delay in his pronunciation. So very often bilingual children like to listen to languages, but they wait until they say their first word, because this is a kind of, you have to figure out that there are 2 different languages or 3 different languages in my family. That person is speaking that language and that person is speaking that language, so what am I going to choose? And then it takes some time for the child to figure out that both, of course, I'm going to speak both. And then he starts speaking, and very often they start with words that are the same in those 2 languages. That's also really funny, like people's names and so on. So that's those are the features. English is of course an exception, because English is the most spoken second language in the world. So in English language we have so many different dialects, and people speak it in very different ways, and it's not so important if it's pronounced exactly the correct way, because people just have to deal with it. People pronounce it in very different ways. But for the native languages, people want to also to pronounce it the way that it was pronounced in their language area. Yeah.
Because I have a 4-year-old kid who speaks 4 languages because of grandparents, and me and my wife speak different languages. And my personal experience tells me that speaking English is a fifth language, in this case, my third language is a bilingual family. I mean, I'm speaking it to my wife, and I know it's not good because the kid feels left out. The kid doesn't contribute and jump into the discussion. I think it's very important psychologically for the development of the kid to be able to jump into the discussion. But less than speaking to the kid, I would recommend that as soon as you can, you switch to that one of the languages is their Phoneme parent language. Because then the kid will be more integrated into your discourse during the day, and I think that's psychologically important.
That's probably true. And also there is this solution that some Finnish-Swedish families use, that both of the parents speak their own native language to each other. So they speak 2 languages in their discussion, and that sometimes feels really confusing, but when you get used to it, it's a good solution also. Yeah. So then you don't have to speak the language that you don't speak, you just have to receive this information. Yeah. Yeah, it has to do with the flexibility of the phoneme map. So it becomes more and more fixed as you grow older. And of course, if you would have this kind of completely 100% monolingual situation, that you would have only one language, the child would never hear any other languages, he would just construct the phoneme map of his native language, and he would never be exposed to any other languages, even from the TV, even from the music or anything like that, only this native language. So then this would actually make the phoneme map very strict. There are also genetical differences in how flexible the phoneme map is, but this exposure of the first 10 years to only one language would make it as strict as possible. And then after that, if that person starts learning a new language for the first time, and is exposed to a new language for the first time after being 10 years old or something like that, it is very difficult. So the phoneme map may not change at all. And what this then practically means is that this person is not going to be able to pronounce the new language well. He is going to have a lot of problems in understanding people speaking this new language, especially if they speak quickly. But he may have perfect writing and reading skills and very good grammar and so on, because those kinds of language skills are not dependent on the flexibility of the phoneme map. So it's a different kind of language skill that you can require. But then if you think about a person who is bilingual or has been exposed to, like all Finnish children are exposed to English language, for example, from the TV and so on. So then the phoneme map remains more flexible. And then learning new languages on top of that will be easier, and the phoneme map will change more easily. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so if the... Yeah. So for example, from my English, you can hear that I'm a Finnish speaker because I use mainly the Finnish phonemes in pronouncing English. That's the way it is. It's called Tankero English for all of those lovers of this dialect. Yeah. Wow. Wow. Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. It does, it really does. And of course the effort that the person is doing in trying to pronounce is very important for the phoneme map. So the exposure, especially after the age of 5 years or something like that, is not so important as the effort in trying to pronounce, and then maybe correcting your own pronunciation and so on. Wow. Yeah. Wow, that's a very interesting story. Thank you for sharing. Now I still want to show you something about the sleep, but I still have one slide, and it is this process of how the consolidation process is going on during the night while we are sleeping, and how you can actually also measure this consolidation process. So here you can see 3 levels of processing. The cortex is kind of the top layer, and when we are awake, the cortex is processing information all the time, and when you measure that from the EEG, or if you were able to measure from the cortical surface, you would see this very high frequency activity. This is the information processing. But when this person is sleeping, the EEG changes completely, and you can see these very slow delta waves on the order of 2 hertz or something like this. It is like sweeping activity across the cortex, and completely a different pattern of activity. And this is making the cortex available for changing the network connections and receiving new information from these consolidating memory processes. The sleep spindles that you can see there, they are something like 10 hertz activity, and this is the discussion between these hippocampal areas, the memory system, and the cortical areas. So this kind of information is completely different during the wakefulness. Most of the information travels from the cortical systems through the thalamic connections towards the hippocampus. But while the person is sleeping, there is also very heavy connections coming from the hippocampal areas towards the cortex. So it is like a bidirectional information flow. And this is what is believed to be the consolidation, the information that is consolidated to the memory trace areas of the cortex. And if you are able to go all the way into the hippocampus, this would then be an animal study, of course. So then you would see these spike ripples that are like this kind of very fast bursts of activity. They are like very small quantums of information that are then sent towards the cortex from the hippocampus itself. And these are very closely phase aligned with the activity that is flowing between the cortical surface, thalamus, and the hippocampus. So this oscillating activity is kind of generating these momentums when the information from the hippocampus can be spread out to the cortical areas. So this is a kind of reactivating this content of memory in the hippocampus and transferring it towards the cortex. And of course the goal here is now that when this person wakes up the next morning, he still has all of his old memories intact. But in those networks there are also the new memory information that is contained there. And this is of course a very interesting thing, because there is no kind of empty space in the brain where you could put the new information. You have to put it in those networks that are during the day responsible for the memories that we have, and also responsible for the information processing that we have. So for example, how do you move your hand? How do you have to send information from your primary motor area to your hand so that the hand is moving like this? This is very important, very basic information. We don't want to change that. But if I have learned some new sequences on the piano, it is those exactly same cortical networks that are telling how to move my hand that are going to receive this new information. And they have to keep it there, and they have to be able to receive it amongst those networks that already have this information on how to move the hand. So the changes that are done to the memory networks during the night, they must be tiny. Otherwise you would be risking the possibility that I cannot move my hand anymore the next day if the network was changed in a wrong way or something like this. This type of research is done especially in animal models, so they teach animals motor sequences, they teach animals maps of mazes, for example, and then during the night they are able to follow with electrodes inserted into those brain areas where the learning occurs during the daytime. They are able to see that this actually is the consolidation process is actually dealing with those exactly same brain areas. So the weights of the neurons are adjusted very slightly, and after that the memory is consolidated. And what you can see in the case of especially this kind of learning that changes the way that person is moving or changes the way that person is thinking, is that this consolidation process can be measured during the night, and it's a heavy process, so it takes a lot of energy from the brain to be changing those weights. As a result of the consolidation, the next day your learning has actually made you better than you were while you were learning. So for example, in a motor skill, if you try to learn juggling, for example, you achieve some kind of skill level in the evening. If you sleep really well, what you can see the next day is that your skill level has taken a step higher. And this is because of the consolidation. And the same holds true also for abstract learning. So if you learn something abstract during the day, and you struggle and you try to keep your head together and understand this very difficult concept, and then you sleep well after that, the next day you will actually have an easier time in understanding that abstract concept because of the consolidation process. So it is kind of setting everything in the kind of right background. Yeah. Yeah. So so there are several things happening. The formation of the new synapses. Yeah, it is part of the consolidation. The formation of the synapses, it's a kind of a long process, so it doesn't happen overnight, but it is kind of a growth that you can see there, and it happens also during the day. The weights are adjusted by changing the strength of the synapses, and especially, of course, the new synapses, but also the old ones. And then there is a third process, which is the accumulation of the myelin. So this insulating fat that is around the axons, and this happens in the white matter, and this is also a process that happens at night. And this is something that makes the information flow faster in the brain. And it's very important especially for motor learning, but also for abstract learning, because it means that the information traveling from one part of the brain to the next part will actually become faster. So this makes also the information processing faster and also more accurate in time. Okay, so let's come to the conclusions here. First of all, we have to understand the learning of the infant brain from several perspectives. We have to think about the task that the brain has. There is a lot of information coming in. Most of this information is just coming via exposure, and the baby may not have the skills to make hypothesis testing because of the lack of the motor activity. So the only thing that is left is just to make the best out of the exposure. And this is practically the case during the first 3 months or half year of the life. So most of the learning happens via exposure. And of course the exposure is plenty. So there's a lot of information. The baby is hearing a lot of people speaking, a lot of music, a lot of sounds from the environment and so on. The information content is rich, so there is a lot of information, so much information that is actually difficult to process all of it. And then later, of course, this turn-taking and communication comes into play. So the child can, for example, point at some object which immediately tells to the parent that now the child wants to know the name of that object. And this is, of course, a very effective way of language learning. And then also there has to happen this process of selecting the features that are important. It's obvious that features like sound intensity are important. If I do this, all of you wake up because it's a very intense sound and the auditory system is programmed to pay attention to something that is very intense and happens surprisingly and so on. Sorry for waking you guys up. So this is an obvious feature. But then there are these other features that are specifically used in a certain language. So for example, in the Finnish language, we use the feature of duration. So if you want to understand Finnish language, you have to be able to differentiate between short and long phonemes. The difference is only 100 milliseconds. It's not a lot. So the auditory system has to pay attention to a feature that previously used to not to be so important. But now suddenly in this language it's very important. So you have to figure out how to pay attention to that specific feature and how to cluster it into two, short and long. So this is a new feature. And when the baby is born, some of the features of that native language that the mother has been speaking during the pregnancy are already coded as important in the auditory system because of the learning that has happened during the fetal period. So this is something that then helps the auditory system to develop further. This feature change that has to occur to every language is the change of paying attention to only the lower frequency content and changing from that to paying attention to the full frequency content, so also to the higher frequencies that contain the information from the formats. And then this learning that occurs before the baby is born, it's of course kind of passive learning. It's receiving new information and it's making sense of that information, but then later we start to have this biphasic learning. So we have this awake learning time when we are gathering new information, and then we have this time of sleep, which is the consolidation of the memories. So you can say that half of the learning happens when you are awake and half of it happens when you are sleeping. So that's how important the consolidation of the memory traces is for the learning. And then in the consolidation process, there is a difference between this kind of obstructive information that is actually showing that your previous information was wrong. And this is very heavy to consolidate because you have to get rid of some of the old information. You have to prove it wrong to yourself. And this requires more activity from the consolidation process. And the consolidation process also makes the learned information seem more clear and more usable. So the next day you have better access to the information compared to the day when you learned it, because the consolidation has not happened yet. And of course the goal of the learning is also to prepare these kinds of tools for the perception. So we have to be able to identify the important features very, very quickly. And some of those tools have already been programmed to the auditory system, for example, noticing a very loud sound or something like that. But the more specific features are then programmed during the learning process. So for example, you can learn to identify a certain person's voice, or you can learn to identify emotional aspects of voices and so on, and so on. And then also later we have to be able to identify the phonemes of our native language really very, very quickly. I still want to say in the end that we are working on this kind of brain research data also on babies' brains. So if you are interested, especially if you have some tasks that you want to maybe think about using these types of data in your tasks, so you are free to contact me. We are mainly using MATLAB-based tools for analyzing the EEG signals. So this is a simple kind of signal processing tasks that are related to finding artifacts in the signals and filtering them, and then finding the sizes of the responses in this. And also we do some audio processing in our studies. And also we have lately been processing also other physiological data, not only EEG, but also data from for example, cardiac activity. Okay, you have been very active with your questions, but do you have any more questions? Yeah? Yeah, there are languages that people don't speak so much. So for example, Latin is an example of that kind of language that people pronounce in many different ways, and if you study Latin, you mainly study it with writing. And then there are also examples, for example, students of theology. They are reading these ancient Greek and so on, these languages, and they are not really speaking those languages, but they are just writing and reading these languages. So it is a kind of a common to have those kinds of skills. But I don't know if those have been studied in the same way. I mean, that's a very difficult question. Of course, we have a lot of people who cannot read or write any language. I mean, we have adults who speak several languages, but they cannot read or write. So it is, yeah, I don't know how to answer that. Yeah. Thank you. More questions? Yes? Yeah, so many of those motor skills or motor sequences are actually then dealt with by the cerebellum. So, for example, walking or riding a bike or even playing a full concerto on the piano can be mainly dictated by the cerebellum. That leaves for the person doing that task the possibility to use the conscious perception for something else. So, for example, if you are a musician, it's not enough that you can physically play the piece, but you are actually there to interpret the piece to the audience, to deliver some emotions to the audience and so on. And in order to do that, to be able to focus on the content, on the emotions, on delivering the piece, you have to be able to play it so automatically that you don't have to think about pressing each key. Well, the motor skill learning has mainly been used as a model in these studies, but I know that some people are studying mathematics from the same point of view. So this would be like an automatized process that when you see some easy thing that you have to solve, you just start, like writing the solution and not thinking about the solution, and meanwhile you can still think about something else related to maybe the same task or something like this. But it's very hard to study it outside the motor domain. More questions? Yeah?
Are there studies about how useful it is to offer early stages of education, kindergarten, elementary school in native language for immigrants?
Well, in Finland we do that, and it's believed to be a kind of a human right also to learn to read and write in your native language. It's very, if you have a small child who goes to a school or kindergarten in a non-native language, the adaptation is very fast. So it seems like there is not a big problem in having the school education in a non-native language. But I think at least in Finland we still think that the native language must be supported. Some researchers even say that it's because of the abstract thinking skills that you would require to have your native language at an adequate level to be able to do that, but I don't know if that can be proven. Yeah, it's of course also a very big political question. Yeah. Other questions?
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah, tomorrow we will have a guest talk by Ericsson about machine learning problems faced for network security. There will also be exercise garage offered in a different room than tomorrow in U8, I think. And on Friday, we will have a last regular lecture by me on feature learning. So how can we learn relevant features by looking at data? Thank you.